Passwords are a pain. They're a hassle for customers and employees to manage, and they're a liability for your organization. All of those password resets cost you money, directly, every day. Plus, they expose you to data breaches, which can cost you even more money and damage your reputation. Your customers feel the pain too. The average internet user has to juggle up to 90 different passwords. No wonder frustrated users abandon their carts. Some just use the same passwords over and over again. Risky behavior for them and for you. Ready for the good news? There is a better way, easier and safer. You can protect your brand with a technology called FIDO. FIDO is a standard that allows security technology to be built directly into any device. With FIDO, users can securely sign into any website without relying on a password. Like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, FIDO is supported on devices that people use every day, such as smartphones, personal computers, tablets, or smartwatches. FIDO lets users log in with a simple fingerprint or face scan, or the touch of a security key. FIDO is also safe. Thanks to public key cryptography, sensitive login information resides securely on a user's device, nowhere else. FIDO is bad news for cybercriminals. It prevents even the most sophisticated phishing attacks. They can't steal users' passwords and take over accounts because you don't rely on passwords. You use FIDO. With FIDO, logging in goes from frustrating to easy, and from risky to fully secure. Now, instead of annoying your customers or losing them, you make them happy. And happy customers are good for business. The worldwide tech industry is working together to make FIDO the future of logins, and many large service providers are already using it to protect their customers. The FIDO iMark tells users they can log in quickly and easily. Passwords? Who needs them? FIDO logs your users in without the liability of passwords. Safe and easy, saving you a lot of headaches and improving your bottom line. Learn more today at loginwithfido.com.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good break. One day I'm gonna get a camera that can not blur on me. So you just saw before our break, great discussion on how FIDO was used in election security, and started to, I think, give you a glance at some of the policy issues around authentication, particularly the difference between phishable and non-phishable authentication. Now that we're back, I'm happy to welcome Andrew Shikiar, who's the Executive Director of the FIDO Alliance, to talk a little bit more about what's happening in the Alliance and the ecosystem. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let me get my screen set up here. So first, I'd like to thank the Better Identity Coalition and the ITRC for collaborating on this very important event. This is the second time we've all worked together. Last time we did this was in person in October of 2019, which feels like 5 years ago. It's been a busy couple of years since last October. But I want to today follow up from that excellent panel before and give you some updates on FIDO Alliance, some added perspectives on where we come from and what we're looking at moving forward. So let's start by talking about digital transformation. I've been around the block a few times, so I'm always kind of skeptical of new movements and new trends, and especially in technology and identity space. But certainly, the idea of moving people to digital systems from offline systems or upgrading digital systems is something that makes sense and needs to happen. In fact, I co-authored a paper with the World Economic Forum that came out last January, talking about exactly that. Passwordless authentication is setting the important cornerstone for digital transformation, and indeed it is. But even then, it's somewhat esoteric talk, and I think that most people, when they talk about digital transformation, have plans like this. In fact, I'd imagine a lot of boardrooms had whiteboards that looked like 5-year plan for digital transformation. Then, of course, COVID hit, and the 5-year plan turned into a 5-month imperative. All of a sudden, people had remote employees. They had customers who couldn't come into physical buildings. And the security and authentication aspects of digital transformation came to the fore as everything was accelerated due to the pandemic. So it wasn't just businesses planning around the COVID imperative, hackers did as well. You can say what you want about hackers, but I think they're opportunists, they're capitalists, and they're pretty smart. So COVID presented them with a large and attractive and very soft attack landscape, which it took advantage of. So you can see in this chart here from Google that there's a massive spike in phishing attacks in 2020. And I suspect that Alex Weinert will talk more about this in his closing comments later on. But this just shows how much COVID created an attack opportunity, and that hackers took advantage of it. And the fact of the matter is, phishing still works, which is why it's so popular and why it's so frequent. And we saw phishing and other forms of hacking accelerate throughout 2020. So we just heard a great conversation about how FIDO security keys help protect the election. But issues did come up, right? Of course, there's a SolarWinds hack, and there were certainly credential related issues associated with SolarWinds. Phishing continues to grow. Social engineering had kind of a renaissance in 2020, if you will. In fact, the Twitter attack that happened, the Twitter hack was due to social engineering. And I still contend that had those system admins been using FIDO security keys for MFA versus something else, that attack probably wouldn't have happened, or the damage wouldn't have been so great. And by the way, that could have been much worse than it actually was. It's also important to realize that hacking and phishing attacks are not a one-time issue. Right? It's not like, oh, this happened, it's in the rearview mirror. It actually feeds into a self-perpetuating cycle of credential theft. And this chart kind of lays that out. Basically, the way this works is, there's some sort of hack or data breach. Billions of credentials are then poured out to the dark web, and this continues to grow. Hackers can then run a tiny business buying these things for pennies, and then successfully stuffing them on sites worldwide. Credential stuffing is a relatively easy thing for a hacker to do, which is why up to 90% of login attempts at e-commerce sites are spoofed or stuffing attempts. What's scary is that there's around a 2% success rate, up to 2% success rate, which leads to billions of dollars of fraud and fraudulent charges to businesses each year. And it's not just consumer sites that are stuffed, it's also enterprises, which is even more valuable, which allows for more credentials to be harvested and fed back into this cycle. Simply put, the only way to break this cycle is to eliminate our dependence on server-side credentials and passwords. There's nothing to steal on the server, this cycle breaks. So to that end, the password model is broken, and I think everyone knows that, right? So as a consumer, we understand they're clumsy, they're hard to remember, they're hard to enter into, say, like a smart TV, but also they sit in a server. Anything on a server can and will eventually be stolen, so they're easy to phish and harvest and replay, as we just demonstrated. Mark Risher in the last panel just talked about how OTPs, how easy it is to hack OTPs as well. So to be clear, any layer of MFA is better than a password alone, but this isn't even a debate anymore. OTPs can be phished, and if you're depending on OTPs, especially SMS OTPs as your second factor, you need to quickly reevaluate the strategy for protecting your people and your resources. So this is why FIDO was formed. This has been FIDO's imperative since day one, is to come up with a simpler and stronger approach to user authentication that's more usable and more secure than both passwords and OTPs. And that's where FIDO's mission has been. That's where we sit. What we do, we create open standards for simpler, stronger authentication using public key cryptography, asymmetric public key cryptography, which is something that the average consumer should never have to pronounce, let alone know what it means. They just need to know that it protects them, it's easy to use. And FIDO is easy to use, right? It's single gesture, possession-based, phishing-resistant authentication. That ease of use is critical for opt-in for stronger authentication, which is one reason why we're seeing strong adoption of this and good utilization. Who is FIDO? We're backed by some of the best brands on the planet. This is our board of directors, around 40 companies who really steer the ship of FIDO Alliance. I look at this list of logos, and the way I like thinking about it is, who needs to sit around the table to solve this problem, this very massive problem? This is the right set of companies, right? We have companies who are shipping platforms and devices at massive scale. We have experts in security and biometrics. And last but not least, we have the service providers who have businesses that are utterly dependent on their ability to deliver high assurance services to billions of users worldwide on a daily basis. In addition to the board, we have sponsored and associate members who kind of build out our ecosystem and reflect this sort of mix. And then we liaise with other standards organizations and .orgs to address adjacent use cases and drive global education. I briefly want to talk about how FIDO works. In the last session, Jeremy said I talked about metadata service. I'm not going to go into much depth, but let's talk about how FIDO does work. So historically, when you go to log into a site, there's a person, as you see on the left, and then a server on the right. And I'd put a password on that server, and if I guessed it right, I'd have access to that server. As we've demonstrated, you don't want to be dependent on that for authentication. What FIDO's done is introduce the concept of an authenticator. The authenticator is both a concept and a thing, such as a security key, as just talked about. And you can think of the authenticator basically mediating this authentication relationship, if you will. When I enroll my FIDO account, my FIDO credentials, what happens is a unique key pair is created, where on the server, there's a public key, on the authenticator, on my device, there's a private key. These things need to match for me to log into anything. Now, the public key has no value, right? So these hackers can steal my public key and do what they want with it. They can't reuse it. There's no material value to that. The private key is the valuable part, and that's stored on my device, where only I can access that. I access that by verifying myself, through a biometric or by touching something. That's how this is activated, if you will. When it comes time to log in to a site, there's a little challenge response dialogue between the server and the authenticator, between the two keys, where metadata is exchanged, where the service provider can find added attributes about the authenticator that they can tweak to their own requirements. But it's that communication that requires a perfect match that really helps protect the authentication process. So that's how FIDO works at a high level. And since it is possession-based, it protects against scalable attacks, right? So you'd have to come to me in my office right now and grab my key or stick your fingerprint on my Windows Hello authenticator for you to hack into my account. It cannot be handled remotely. By the way, I saw some chat before that FIDO is like PKI. It is. And so I like saying, and someone else quoted this, it wasn't my quote originally, FIDO is like PKI without the I. It's public key cryptography without the burden of the infrastructure, which makes it very usable. FIDO's always sought to align with global policy since day one. We've been engaging with different regulatory bodies, say in Europe, for example. We know we're very well aligned with GDPR and the SDA requirements for PSD2. We engage with other NGOs. So I talked about WEF, we've done work with FATF, which was talked about yesterday, World Bank and others. Likewise, we have members inside of FIDO Alliance, right? So we build our specs based on actual use cases. We have governments here. These are some of the governments that are members: the German, UK, Australian, US, and Korean governments. They actively take part in our alliance and help us build best practices. And then last but not least, we see governments deploying FIDO, right? This is a huge proof point. I think as Phil Amos here talked about login.gov, the exciting work happening there. The UK government's deploying it, NHS in the UK is using it, the Korean government, Taiwanese government, Canadian government. We're seeing more and more government gravitation, policy gravitation towards FIDO and FIDO authentication. So let's look back at 2020. I want to go through what we accomplished since we talked to you last and run through some highlights to set the stage for bigger things to come. So first of all, we kicked off the year last January, which again feels like a lifetime ago, announcing that Apple joined FIDO Alliance and joined FIDO's board of directors. This was significant for a number of reasons, not least of which is the fact that after each of these presentations, I could stop answering the question, so where's Apple? But more significant than that is it really sent a powerful signal to the industry that really everyone is coalescing around FIDO as the organization to collaborate on standards-based, user-friendly, strong authentication. And Apple have been building FIDO support into their products for some time. This commitment only accelerated that, and we're thrilled to have Apple actively taking part and contributing to FIDO Alliance. Another key highlight from 2020 is this, and this is quite an eye chart. I'm not going to run through all of it. What this shows is the level of FIDO support across operating system and browser combinations with different transport mechanisms for the authenticator. The takeaway I'd like you to have is that this chart has gotten broader and greener than it was in 2019. In fact, that the breadth comes from the addition of the Apple environments now supporting FIDO. So you can use your Touch ID or Face ID to log into websites that support FIDO authentication now with the latest release of Safari and Mac OS, Big Sur. So we're very excited about seeing this grow, and hopefully by this time next year, it'll be even greener and a little broader as well. So all told, over 4 billion devices can now support FIDO authentication, and that's probably the most important figure we can focus on. All right, so over 2019, 2020, we were very focused on addressing kind of the endpoint issue, if you will. All right, so when a service provider would ask, well, yeah, this sounds great, but who can use it? Well, the answer is, a heck of a lot of people can. You have 4 billion devices that support it. Over 86% of browsers in use today can support FIDO authentication, like as is. So this built-in factor, this dial-tone factor, if you will, means that service providers can now deploy FIDO with confidence, knowing that consumers can use it. Which is why we're seeing that government adoption. Which is why we're seeing, growing utilization by a number of service providers that are tapping into FIDO. This is a list of some companies that I'm just highlighting to show kind of the breadth of industry and geography of groups that are supporting FIDO. Some of these are consumer, some of these are enterprise, some of these are citizen facing. Interesting one, the bottom right, Verify. I don't know if you've heard about this. This is from FIDO board member Dayon. They are working with American Airlines and now BA to do a biometric approved or biometric protected, FIDO biometric protected app where you can store your health records and things like that in a mobile app to help facilitate ease of travel across borders. So in addition to adoption, we're seeing more and more regulatory policy cite FIDO, right? So the last session was about protecting U.S. elections with FIDO security keys. That was guidance from CISA. Likewise, there's other guidance coming from other U.S. agencies and different global agencies pointing to FIDO as preferred means of doing user authentication. This is important for a couple of reasons. One is that it's leading to government deployments of FIDO, which is always great. But perhaps more significant is that regulated industry will follow the lead of government, say NIST, the NIST guidelines. So we're seeing more and more kind of, traditionally kind of laggard type companies and industries now following suit in putting FIDO front and center in their user authentication plans. So in short, I think that FIDO is becoming part of the DNA of the web itself, which is a pretty audacious statement. But let's think about what it means to be part of the DNA of the web. Things like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi or SSL. These are all parts of how you operate on the web today. I think it requires three things. First, industry standardization and collaboration. And we've demonstrated that we have that, right? Everyone who really matters is collaborating inside of FIDO lines today. Secondly, you need to be shipping devices and platforms at massive scale. I think it was Stina who said it's just there. FIDO is there, right? So we're in these devices. It's in people's hands literally right now every day. With an eye shot of me, I see 3 different devices, not to mention the 15 security keys on my desk that support FIDO. And last but not least, strong regulatory and government embrace. This is a focus area for us. We've made good progress and we'll continue to grow this moving forward. So what's ahead, right? I think we've made great progress. Our specifications are mature. We're seeing market adoption, but there's still work to be done. So a couple of things are ahead. So first, in 2021, we'll continue to round out our specifications. We're doing some revs to the core FIDO authentication specs that will be brought forward throughout this year. But a lot of our focus really is on driving adoption, accelerating adoption, if you will. So Bob had a great point in the last session, Bob Lord. UX is something we need to focus on. So yes, it's easier to use, but it still is a paradigm shift. So people need to understand, we need to understand how consumers and users best react to the concept of FIDO authentication. So we have an activity happening right now inside of FIDO. We have a task force of design and UX experts from our members, some of the biggest brands on the planet, who are guiding research that will ultimately result in a set of implementation guidelines, UX guidelines, for the most effective way to implement FIDO authentication. So how do you use these FIDO marks that we've introduced? What's the best language to use? What's going to resonate with consumers as you ask them to enroll in FIDO authentication, as you ask them to log in? So we're doing both qualitative and quantitative research. This will be delivered in the first half of the year. We also have a corresponding kind of technical document called How to FIDO It's actually open for utilization. It's on GitHub. These two things together should give an end-to-end recipe book, if you will, for how to implement FIDO. And we'll have a reference implementation standing at the end of this that people can point to. So we think that's a really important deliverable to help accelerate adoption. Someone off mute, I think that's Ann. We'll also focus on case studies. So we hear again and again that people want to see what other companies are doing. And so we'll focus on this. We will deliver more case studies this year, very detailed case studies and white papers, also video interviews. But what's really cool is that these implementations have been out now for a while. It's really not early adoption anymore. It's people are on their second or third wave. So there's data coming in. So we'll focus on kind of data-driven guidance on how to implement FIDO. So we're super excited about that. Last year, FIDO introduced or announced the fact that we're taking on additional work areas, right? So our work in authentication is not done, but to really meet our entire goal of protecting, users at scale, protecting the integrity of the network economy, it's important for us to look at adjacent work areas. And there's two spaces that we're focusing on, and both are making great progress. The first area is around identity verification. One of the soft spots for FIDO is account recovery. And traditionally, we've told people that if you lose your FIDO authenticator, to re-enroll, which opens the door for potential account takeovers through social engineering. So we have a working group that's focused on creating, better practices and new technologies for possession-based identity verification and account onboarding. In essence, through safer and stronger account onboarding, we'll have more secure account recovery. So that's a very important initiative. Another space around IoT. There's all sorts of horror stories about passwords, holding, people hostage for IoT devices. There's really billions of things out there right now that need to be connected to the internet. Passwords are a weak spot there. So we're focused on our first set of specifications around IoT have actually been released in draft form. They'll be finalized in the next couple of months. The primary use case initially is in industrial IoT. When you're talking about billions of devices, any sort of password hack could cripple all the smart infrastructure that so many cities and municipalities and businesses are depending on. So we're focused on that, and that work is progressing well. You'll hear more from us about IoT in early Q2. So both these are important work areas. They're both advancing very well, and this is going to be a lot of our technical focus, if you will, in 2021. Last but not least, we have a conference series that we launched this past year. So as we're seeing more of a groundswell of support and interest in FIDO, it's important for us to build community and bring the community together. And so we had the first Authenticate conference this past November. It was meant to be in person, of course it wasn't. Over the course of 2 weeks, we had thousands of people attend, around 30 or 40 or 50 sessions, I think. Very well received, very positive feedback. We're going to build on that to help drive our goal of educating the market at large through some virtual summits, as well as an in-person Authenticate conference this October. So I'd encourage you to visit our Authenticate website, which is authenticatecon.com, to find out about these events in 2021. So to summarize, FIDO is very much the present and the future of user authentication. It's been real interesting attending the sessions yesterday and today to hear about the broader identity context, but also the critical role that standards-based better authentication plays in protecting identity systems, identity infrastructure, and that's something we're focused on. So we think that FIDO provides a simpler approach to user authentication. It's ready to use today, and so we certainly encourage all of you in the audience to take a look at the specifications, take a look at the wide array of products that are out there in market that support FIDO, and figure out how those can be brought to bear for your organization moving forward. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Q&A.
Hey, Andrew. So I've been following the Q&A. I got to say, you must have done a good job, because aside from a bit of discussion and chat about how to do more work on the user experience, which I think you then addressed, anticipating things, there hasn't been a ton of questions. Let me throw you one just before we get to our next panel, since I know we're close to time, which is, I think there's a big message here, which is that we're shifting with FIDO right now from an era where MFA was something that you had to bolt on by giving somebody something, else, into something where it's now being built into many devices in terms of just ubiquitous support for it in platforms and browsers. What do things look like, say, 3 years from now? And knowing that you're, speaking to an audience of people focused on the government and policy space, what are some of those big takeaways?
Yeah, I think 3 years from now, first of all, for all of us as consumers, as we all are, I think the vast majority of mainstream internet services will offer passwordless options. We think most of those will be leveraging FIDO, and it's exactly for the reason you mentioned, Jeremy, is that it's a built-in effect that you have built-in authenticators to every device that will be in your hand, and there's an ability to use that across device environments, across logins. So I think that's really important. From a government services standpoint, a policy standpoint, this makes things a little bit more predictable. So it allows you to think about developing, deploying government services, knowing that there is a standards-based approach to authentication that's being supported across products by multiple vendors, both on the kind of infrastructure side as well as at the device layer for consumers. That's also one reason why we're introducing these consumer marks. So we've gotten feedback from some of the relying parties inside of FIDO Alliance that yes, they have very strict rules, if you will, for how they handle their points of login, but they also see a need to have some common user experience across these things. Because Bob was saying, security keys right now, every enrollment experience is different. We're going to work to smooth that out and make it more common. So I think that as consumers get used to seeing, let's say, an iMark or FIDO mark logging in one place, they'll be more apt to do so for a government service or another service.
Great, thanks. Well, look, this has been a great overview. I want to shift now to introduce the next panel. So Andrew, thanks for taking the time to beam in from the West Coast today.